Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Tragical Comedy or the Comical Tragedy of Mr. Punch. Now, this is a graphic novel written by Neil Gaiman and illustrated by Dave McKean and published by Vertigo Comics, which is an imprint of DC Comics. And this was first published in 1994. Now, Neil Gaiman is the author of books like American Gods, Coraline, and Stardust, and he's also the writer of comics like The Sandman and the Books of Magic. Now, Dave McKean I'm primarily familiar with as the illustrator of one of my favorite Batman graphic novels, Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth. And he also did the illustrations for the illustrated version of Stephen King's Wizard and Glass. And he also worked with Neil Gaiman before he did the cover art for many of the issues of The Sandman. Now, when I first heard of this comic, I thought this was going to be a fantasy story or some kind of horror story knowing Neil Gaiman's other work, but it really isn't. Like, any supernatural elements in this story are purely metaphorical or purely in the main character's head. This is really a coming-of-age drama about a little boy observing and coming to grips with the ugliness of adulthood and the ugliness within his own family. And honestly, it's a deeply moving and heartbreaking story, and also kind of a haunting story as well. Even though I wouldn't call this a horror story, it's definitely haunting, because I actually would consider this to be a ghost story, even though I said there's no supernatural elements in it. When I say it's a ghost story, I mean that more in a metaphorical sense. Like, this is what I would call a metaphorical ghost story, whereas the ghosts are actually memories. But also, maybe I'm just saying that because I feel like Dave McKean's artwork has such a ghostly style about it. Now, the plot of Mr. Punch is it's about this unnamed protagonist who you could say is Neil Gaiman himself. Now, I've heard some people say that this book is sort of semi-autobiographical. Now, I don't know too much about Neil Gaiman's childhood to know how true this actually is to his childhood growing up, but you could say that the main character is at least based on Gaiman himself. But basically, it's about this man reflecting back on something that happened to him or something that he witnessed when he was a child. The story primarily follows him when he was 8 years old and he was staying with his grandparents who owned this, like, failing seaside arcade, and the only real attractions at this arcade were a mermaid who was obviously played by an actress and this Punch and Judy man. And right in the beginning of the story, you find out that this boy's grandfather eventually went insane, and the story itself is taking place right before he went insane, and eventually in the story you see something that probably led to the grandfather going insane. And without giving too much away, it does have something to do with this Punch and Judy man and this actress who played the mermaid. And the whole story sort of parallels the story of Mr. Punch, which is this old puppet show about this man named Mr. Punch who murders his baby, murders his wife, and manages to get the hangman hanged in his place, and also manages to outwit Satan himself. Now, I thought the Tragical Comedy or the Comical Tragedy of Mr. Punch was a very powerful story, but also a really sad story as well, and it really is a story about memories. It's about how memories affect us, it's about how we as adults remember things that happened to us as children, and how sometimes it's not exactly how we remember it, and it also talks about how the people that we might have looked up to when we were children maybe weren't the best of people. But there's also no black and white there either. Like, the characters in this book are very much painted with sort of a shade of gray. And even though this is a comic book, it's almost poetic in a way, and of all of Neil Gaiman's stuff, and truthfully I've only read a little bit of his stuff, but of the stuff I've read from him so far, this is probably my favorite. And a lot of that has to do with Dave McKean's artwork. Like, his artwork in this book is absolutely beautiful. Like, here are a few examples of the artwork, and one thing you'll notice is that some of it's like traditional, like comic book art style, but some of it's actually like real pictures that he uses. Like, here's another example of what I mean. That's supposed to be the main character's grandfather, and it uses actual pictures of an actor there as opposed to traditional artwork, and I think that's really fascinating how it's a combination between traditional artwork and actual pictures. And all the stuff dealing with the Punch and Judy puppet show, it actually takes pictures of real puppets and incorporates that into the artwork. So whenever you see Mr. Punch, like, it's not really a drawing, and I thought that was really cool. And this combination of drawings and actual pictures gives the comic a weird, surreal atmosphere, but also gives it a sort of reality as well. And to me, the artwork fits the story so well. And I'll admit, when I was first introduced to Dave McKean's artwork, I was a little turned off by it, but over the years, I've definitely sort of grown used to it, and once again, I can't imagine this story without the artwork. I feel the same way about Batman Arkham Asylum. I can't imagine that story without Dave McKean's artwork. Now, I know this is gonna sound random, but I actually highly recommend listening to the song What's It Feel Like to Be a Ghost by Taking Back Sunday while you're reading this. For some reason, I always felt like that song fits so beautifully with Dave McKean's artwork. Like, I also listen to that song whenever I read Arkham Asylum. But yeah, that was my review on the Tragical Comedy or the Comical Tragedy. I know this edition has Comical Tragedy and Tragical Comedy reversed, but that was my review of Mr. Punch, and bye.